The acceptance letter trembled in my hands as tears blurred the words full tuition and academic scholarship. After 4 years of perfect grades, volunteer work, and relentless studying, I had finally done it. Secured my path to college without touching the fund my parents had promised was mine. I should have been ecstatic. Instead, I felt hollow as I remembered the day they emptied that account to bail out my brother Vinny again, telling me, "He needs it more than you, Madison. You're the strong one." Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Little did they know just how strong I would become, or how desperately they would regret that decision 5 years later. I sat cross-legged on my twin bed, the one I'd had since childhood, surrounded by the glow of string lights and the soft hum of my ancient desk fan. The acceptance letter from Westridge University lay open beside me while I scrolled through their financial aid portal. Even with the academic scholarship, there was still a $12,000 gap per year that needed to be filled. $12,000. That should have been covered by my college fund, the one my grandparents had started the day I was born, the one my parents had emptied 8 months ago. My door was closed, but I could still hear them downstairs. My mother Judy's soft murmuring, trying to calm my father Gabriel's booming voice. They were arguing about Vinny again. At 25, my brother was living in our basement after his third failed business venture, the latest being an app development company that had hemorrhaged money for 18 months before collapsing. "He just needs more time," my mother insisted. "The next idea could be the one that takes off." I closed my laptop, feeling the weight of responsibility settle onto my shoulders. The responsible daughter, the low-maintenance child, the one who never caused trouble, never demanded attention, never needed rescuing, the one whose future could be sacrificed because I was capable while my brother was struggling. My phone buzzed with a text from my best friend Sienna. "Did the financial package come through? Are we roommates or what?" I stared at her message, unsure how to respond. Sienna had been accepted to Westridge too, and we'd been planning to room together since sophomore year of high school. Her parents had saved diligently for her education. Her future was secure. Mine hung in the balance. I texted back, "Still figuring things out. We'll call you tomorrow." My gaze drifted to the framed photo on my desk, me at 14, proudly holding the regional spelling bee trophy. Standing beside me were my beaming parents, their hands on my shoulders. Our little genius. They'd called me that day. The memory felt distant now, belonging to a different family. The arguing downstairs suddenly stopped. Footsteps on the stairs. A soft knock on my door. "Madison, can we talk?" My mother's voice, tentative. I took a deep breath, smoothing my expression into something neutral before calling, "Come in." My parents entered, my father lingering awkwardly by the door while my mother perched on the edge of my bed. They looked tired. They always looked tired these days. "We saw the letter from Westridge," my mother began, forcing enthusiasm into her voice. "Congratulations, sweetie. We're so proud of you." I nodded, waiting. There was more. There was always more. My father cleared his throat. "We've been looking at our finances, trying to figure out how to help with tuition." "Don't worry about it," I said automatically. "I'll take out loans." "Madison," my mother reached for my hand, "we never wanted this to happen. When we used your college fund for Vinny's business, we truly believed he would be able to pay it back before you needed it." The familiar justification made something cold settle in my chest. It wasn't that they had prioritized Vinny. It was that they had done it believing there would be no consequences. That somehow the broken promises wouldn't matter because things would magically work out. "We know it's not fair," my father added, running a hand through his salt and pepper hair. "But you've always been the smart one, the capable one. Schools will be fighting to give you scholarships." The capable one. It wasn't a compliment. It was the reason they felt justified in taking what was mine. Vinny's meeting with an investor. Next week, my mother said, hope brightening her tired eyes. This new idea has real potential. If it takes off, we could have your money back before the fall semester. I looked at them. These people who had raised me, who had once protected me, who now saw me as the child who needed less protection because I could fend for myself, who had taught me, unintentionally, that success was its own punishment. That's great, I said, my voice hollow. I hope it works out for him. It will, my father said with the same certainty he'd had about all of Vinny's ventures. And then we'll make this right. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. They took my silence for acceptance, perhaps even forgiveness. My mother squeezed my hand before standing. Get some rest, sweetie. We'll figure this out. After they left, I sat in the quiet of my room, listening to the cicadas outside my window. The acceptance letter still lay on my bed, a testament to years of hard work, and a reminder that hard work wasn't always enough when the playing field wasn't level. I reached for my laptop again, opening a browser and typing, how to apply for student loans without parent information. As the search results populated, I made a silent promise to myself. This would be the last time I depended on my parents for anything. The last time their choices determined my future. The last time I accepted that Vinny's needs would always come before mine. I didn't know it then, but that night was the beginning of a transformation. From the dutiful daughter who accepted her role in the family hierarchy to someone who would forge her own path, regardless of the obstacles placed in her way. Someone who, years later, would have to decide whether to answer when those same parents called, desperately needing the help of the child they had once sacrificed. Someone who would learn that strength wasn't about enduring unfairness. It was about refusing to accept it. 3 weeks after receiving my acceptance letter, I sat at our kitchen table surrounded by student loan applications. The house was quiet. My parents were at one of Vinny's investor meetings. For moral support, my mother had explained. I didn't ask to go. I knew my place. My laptop pinged with an email notification. Westridge University Housing Department. Dear Madison, we're pleased to confirm your housing assignment for the fall semester with your requested roommate, Sienna Alvarez. To secure your placement, please submit the $1,500 housing deposit by May 15th. I stared at the screen. May 15th was 10 days away. The student loans I was applying for wouldn't be processed that quickly. I had exactly $730 in my savings account. Money. From my part-time job at the local bookstore where I worked weekends. My phone rang. Sienna. Did you get the housing email? She asked, excitement bubbling in her voice. We got paired together. I'm already planning our room decor. I'm thinking string lights. Maybe one of those tapestry things for the wall. Sienna, I interrupted. I might not be able to go. Silence. Then, what are you talking about? You got the scholarship, right? The scholarship covers most of the tuition, but not all of it. And there's still housing, books, meal plan. My voice trailed off. But your college fund is gone. The words hung between us. I hadn't told Sienna about my parents taking my college fund. Somehow saying it out loud made it too real, too humiliating. What do you mean gone? How can it be gone? I took a deep breath. My parents gave it to Vinny for his business venture, the one that failed, like all the others. Are you serious? That was your money. The outrage in her voice mirrored what I couldn't allow myself to feel. They said he needed it more than me. I tried to keep my voice neutral, but bitterness crept in. Sienna stopped herself. I'm coming over. 20 minutes later, we sat on the front porch swing, the same one where we'd spent countless afternoons since elementary school. Sienna's dark curls were pulled into a messy bun, her expression fierce as I explained everything. How my parents had emptied the account, their promises that Vinny would pay it back, the constant refrain that I was the capable one who could figure things out. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. So basically, they punished you for being responsible, Sienna said, shaking her head. That's so messed up. They don't see it that way. They think they're being fair by giving Vinny extra support because he struggles more. That's not fair. That's enabling, Sienna said bluntly. And it's stealing from you. I'd never let myself think of it as stealing before. In our family, resources went to whoever needed them most. And somehow, Vinny always needed them most. Have you told them about the housing deposit? Sienna asked. I shook my head. They're at Vinny's investor meeting. Apparently this one's promising. Sienna rolled her eyes. Just like the last one, and the one before that? She squeezed my hand. You know my parents would help if… No, I said firmly. I'm not taking money from your family. Then what are you going to do? I didn't have an answer. Later that evening, I heard the front door open, followed by laughter. Genuine, unburdened laughter that had become rare in our house. I emerged from my room to find my parents and Vinny in the living room, their faces flushed with excitement. Madison! My mother beckoned me over. You won't believe it. The investors loved Vinny's pitch. They're going to fund the entire project. That's great, I said, forcing enthusiasm into my voice. This should have been good news. Maybe Vinny could finally pay back my college fund. We're going out to celebrate, my father announced. Get your coat. Actually, I held up the housing email I'd printed out. I need to talk to you about something. My mother took the paper, scanning it quickly. Oh, that's wonderful. You and Sienna will be roommates. I need $1,500 for the deposit, I said. By next week. The celebration the room dimmed. My parents exchanged glances. Well, my father started, this investor funding is just the beginning. It will take some time before… How much are they investing? I interrupted. Vinny stepped forward. $750,000, he said, unable to keep the pride from his voice. They're taking a 40% stake, but… So you have money now, I said, looking directly at my brother. You can pay back my college fund. The room fell silent. Vinny looked uncomfortable, glancing at our parents for support. Madison, my mother's voice took on the pacifying tone she used when explaining why things couldn't be fair. The investment money isn't for personal use. It's for the business. My college fund wasn't for personal use either, I replied, my voice steady despite the anger building inside me. It was for my education. You got a scholarship, Vinny said defensively. You don't even need… I still need $12,000 per year, I cut him off. Plus housing, books, and living expenses. My father sighed, rubbing his temples. The business will take time to generate profit. Once it does, of course, Vinny will pay you back. When? I pressed, because I need the housing deposit in 10 days or I lose my spot. We'll figure something out, my mother assured me, the same empty promise I'd heard for months. Like what? Another loan? I gestured to the paperwork spread across the kitchen table. Because that's what I've been doing all day, trying to figure out how to go into debt for an education that was supposed to be paid for. Madison, please, my mother implored. This is Vinny's moment. Can't we just celebrate tonight and worry about this tomorrow? I looked at them. My mother's pleading eyes, my father's uncomfortable stance, Vinny's mixture of guilt and defensiveness, and something inside me hardened. No, I said simply. We can't. The word hung in the air like a thunderclap. No. A complete sentence. A boundary. The first of many I would learn to draw. The silence that followed my refusal stretched uncomfortably. My parents looked at me as if I'd suddenly started speaking a foreign language. In our family, celebrations for Vinny's potential successes were mandatory. regardless of how many times those potentials had fizzled into failures. "I think I'll skip dinner," I said, my voice calm despite the storm inside me. "I need to finish these loan applications." "Madison," my father started, but I was already walking back to the kitchen table. I could feel their eyes on me as I sat down and picked up my pen. This wasn't the Madison they knew, the peacekeeper, the one who went along with family decisions without complaint, the one who understood that Vinny's needs came first. After a moment of hushed conversation, I heard the front door open and close. The house fell silent. They had gone without me. Instead of feeling hurt, I felt strangely liberated. I pulled my laptop closer and opened a new browser tab. If I couldn't depend on my family, I needed alternatives. For the next 3 hours, I researched every possible financial option: additional scholarships, work-study programs, part-time jobs near campus. I created spreadsheets detailing potential income sources, projected expenses, and timelines. By midnight, I had a plan. Not a perfect one, but a path forward that depended on no one but myself. My phone buzzed with a text from my mother. "Bringing you leftovers. Love you." I didn't respond. When they returned, I was still at the kitchen table, surrounded by notes and printouts. My mother placed a takeout container beside me. "We missed you at dinner," she said softly. I nodded without looking. "Up, Madison, I know you're upset," she continued. "But you have to understand." "I do understand," I interrupted, finally meeting her gaze. "I understand perfectly." She seemed taken aback by my tone. Not angry, not tearful, but detached. As if I were discussing the weather, rather than the betrayal that had altered the course of my life. "Your father and I have been talking," she ventured. "We might be able to help with the housing deposit. We could put it on a credit card." "I figured it out," I said, gesturing to my notes. "I don't need your help." My mother's expression flickered between relief and concern. "That's good, but you shouldn't have to do this alone." "Shouldn't I?" I asked mildly. "Isn't that what being the capable one means?" My words hit their mark. My mother flinched, then reached for my hand. "Madison, we never meant to hurt you." I gently withdrew my hand. Intent doesn't change impact. It was something my psychology teacher had said during a class discussion about family dynamics. I hadn't understood how profoundly true it was until now. My mother's eyes welled with tears. This was the moment I was supposed to backpedal, to comfort her, to assure her that everything was fine. That's what Madison would have done. The old Madison. Instead, I gathered my papers into a neat stack. "I'm going to bed. I have an early shift at the bookstore tomorrow." I left her standing in the kitchen, her expression a mixture of confusion and hurt. The expected guilt didn't come. In its place was a strange, quiet certainty. I was changing, becoming someone new out of necessity. The next morning, I woke before dawn and dressed quietly. As I passed Vinny's basement door, I paused. My relationship with my brother had always been complicated. I didn't hate him. In many ways, he was as much a product of our parents' uneven nurturing as I was. He the perpetually rescued, me the perpetually self-sufficient. But understanding didn't equate to acceptance. Not anymore. At the bookstore, I approached my manager Kelly as soon as she arrived. "I need more hours," I said without preamble. "As many as you can give me." Kelly raised an eyebrow. "College fund not covering everything?" "Something like that." She studied me for a moment, then nodded. "I can give you 3 additional shifts, and if you're willing to work inventory nights, that's time and a half." "I'll take all of it," I said. By Valley. The end of my shift, my schedule had nearly doubled. It wouldn't be enough for tuition, but it would cover the housing deposit. A start. When I arrived home, I found an envelope on my bed. Inside was $500 in cash and a note in my father's handwriting. Madison for your housing deposit. No strings. Attached. We love you. Dad, I stared at the money, emotions warring within me. Relief. I wouldn't have to work myself to exhaustion before the deadline. Anger? This sudden generosity only came after I'd shown I could manage without them. Suspicion. Where had this money come from, when just yesterday they couldn't help? My door opened, and my father stood in the doorway, his expression cautious. "Did you find the envelope?" he asked. I nodded. "Where did it come from?" He shifted uncomfortably. "I spoke with Vinny this morning, explained the situation." Understanding dawned. "So this is from him? From his investors?" "From Vinny," my father corrected. "He agreed it was the right thing to do." "After you told him to," I said flatly. My father sighed. "Does it matter?" "The deposit is covered. You can room with Sienna." "It matters," I said quietly. "It matters that it took me refusing to play my usual role for anyone to consider that I deserved what was promised to me." My father looked genuinely bewildered. "Madison, we've always supported you." "You've always expected me to support myself," I corrected. "While supporting Vinny, there's a difference." I picked up the envelope and extended it toward him. "Tell Vinny thank you, but I've already figured out how to cover the deposit." My father's eyes widened. "Don't be proud, Madison. Just take the money." "It's not about pride," I said. "It's about trust. I don't trust that this money comes without expectations. I don't trust that next week or next month there won't be another crisis where Vinny needs it back. That's not fair, isn't it?" I kept my arm outstretched, the envelope suspended between us like a physical manifestation of the chasm that had opened in our relationship. After a long moment, my father took the envelope. "Keep it for now," I said. "If Vinny's business succeeds, like you all believe it will, he can pay back my entire college fund, not just the deposit." My father nodded slowly, a new wariness in his eyes as he regarded me, as if seeing for the first time that his reliable, accommodating daughter had begun transforming into someone altogether different, someone who would no longer accept less than she deserved. The week after I refused Vinny's money changed the atmosphere in our house. My parents walked on eggshells around me, unsure how to navigate this new version of their daughter who no longer conformed to their expectations. Vinny avoided me entirely, slipping out of rooms when I entered as if my presence made him physically uncomfortable. I focused on my plan. Each day after school, I worked at the bookstore. Each night, I applied for scholarships and small grants. Each morning, I checked my bank account balance, watching it grow incrementally. On Wednesday, I received an email from Ms. Reynolds, my AP Calculus teacher. "Madison, I'm putting together a list of candidates for the Henderson Mathematical Excellence Scholarship. The award is $5,000 per year for students demonstrating exceptional aptitude in mathematics. I'd like to nominate you. Can you stop by my classroom tomorrow to discuss?" Ms. Reynolds. The Henderson Scholarship wasn't on any of the lists I'd researched. It was local, under the radar, exactly the kind of opportunity I needed. I replied immediately, confirming I would meet with her. That evening, as I was preparing dinner, another change in the household dynamic, as I'd taken over meal preparation. To free up more of my mother's time for extra shifts at her nursing job, my phone rang. The caller ID displayed a number I didn't recognize. "Hello? Is this Madison Wright?" The voice was female, elderly, with a crisp professionalism that immediately commanded attention. "Yes, this is she." "Madison, my name is Imogene Henderson. I understand Eleanor Reynolds is nominating you for my scholarship." I nearly dropped the spatula I was holding. "Mrs. Henderson?" "Yes, she mentioned it just today." "Eleanor has excellent judgment when it comes to students with potential, Mrs. Henderson continued. "But I prefer to make my own assessments as well. Are you available to meet this Saturday at the Westside Library at 10 a.m.? "Yes, absolutely," I said, trying to keep my voice steady despite my excitement. Wonderful. Bring examples of your mathematical work, particularly any innovative approaches you've developed. I'm interested in creativity as much as technical proficiency. After confirming the details, I hung up and leaned against the kitchen counter, allowing myself a moment of hope. $5,000 per year would make a significant dent in my financial gap. My mother entered the kitchen, eyeing the half-prepared meal. Need any help? I've got it, I said, returning to the stove. You've been cooking every night this week, she observed. You don't have to do that. I know, I replied simply. I didn't explain that taking control of household tasks was another way of establishing my independence, of demonstrating both to them and to myself that I could manage on my own. Madison? My mother hesitated, then continued. Your father and I have been talking. We think you should reconsider Vinny's offer. The money is just sitting there. I stirred the pasta sauce, keeping my back to her. I meant what I said. If Vinny wants to help, he can repay the entire college fund. That's not possible right now. The investor money is tied up in the business. Then my answer is still no. My mother sighed. This isn't like you, Madison. You've always been understanding about family matters. I turned to face her. Maybe that's the problem. The doorbell rang, interrupting our conversation. A moment later, my father called out, Madison, someone here to see you. I turned off the stove and headed to the front door, where I found Sienna standing with a folder tucked under her arm. Hey, she said, her expression unusually serious. Can we talk? We retreated to the backyard patio, away from listening ears. Sienna opened the folder and slid a printout toward me. So I was doing some research about your situation, she began, and I found something interesting. The printout was from a legal website, outlining custodial accounts for minors. I scanned the highlighted section. When funds are placed in custodial accounts designated for a minor's education, the custodian, typically the parent, has a fiduciary responsibility to manage those funds in the best interest of the minor. Using these funds for purposes other than the minor's benefit may constitute a breach of fiduciary duty. I looked up at Sienna. What are you saying? I'm saying, she lowered her voice, that if your grandparents set up that college fund specifically, for you, your parents might not have had the legal right to give it to Vinny. The possibility sent a shock through me. You think what they did was illegal? I don't know, Sienna admitted. It depends on how the account was set up. But it's worth looking into. How would I even do that? My Aunt Millie is a financial advisor, Sienna said. She could help you understand what type of account it was and what rights you have. No pressure, but she's willing to meet with you if you want. I stared at the printout, a new awareness dawning. All this time, I'd accepted that my parents had the right to redistribute family money as they saw fit. But what if some of that money was legally mine? What if their decision wasn't just unfair, but improper? When can I meet her? I asked. 2 days later, I sat across from Millie Alvarez in her downtown office. Unlike my parents, who treated financial matters with vague hand-waving, Millie was precise and straightforward. Based on what you've described, she said after hearing my story, it sounds like your grandparents established a 529 education savings plan with you as the named beneficiary. Is that correct? I think so, I said. They always called it my college fund. Millie nodded. And your parents were the account custodians? When I confirmed this, she continued, while custodians have some flexibility in managing 529 funds, using the money for someone other than the named beneficiary, especially for purposes unrelated to education, is problematic. Problematic how? Potentially a breach of fiduciary duty, she explained. Additionally, depending on the circumstances, there could be tax implications. She leaned forward. Madison, do you have any documentation about this account? Statements? The original paperwork? I shook my head. My parents handled everything. I see. Millie tapped her pen thoughtfully. You have a right to request information about accounts established for your benefit. I can help draft a letter requesting that information. And if they refuse? There are options, she said carefully. But let's start with the request. Sometimes, simply letting people know you understand your rights is enough to change the conversation. As I left Millie's office, clutching a folder of information she'd prepared for me, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months. Power. Not the false power of being labeled the capable one, but the genuine empowerment that comes with knowledge. Parents had always controlled the narrative about family resources. They decided what was fair, what was necessary, who deserved what. For the first time, I understood that their authority wasn't absolute, that there were rules and boundaries even they had to respect. I hadn't been searching for leverage. I'd simply been trying to find a way forward on my own. But now I had something unexpected, a legitimate claim, backed by law. The question was, what would I do with it? Saturday morning, I sat at my desk with a blank notebook open before me. It was time to assess my situation, not just financially, but wholly. The meeting with Mrs. Henderson was in 3 hours, but first I needed clarity. I labeled the top of the page Assets and began listing everything I had working in my favor. Academic scholarship, $20,000 year. 2. Potential Henderson scholarship, $5,000 year my 3. Current savings, $2,647 every 4s. Increased hours at bookstore, $800 month. 5. Legal information about 529 accounts. Sienna's family connections, Millie. 7. Strong relationship with teachers, counselors, 8. Perfect academic record. I flipped to a new page and wrote liabilities. Remaining tuition gap, $7,000 year without Henderson scholarship. 2. Housing, books, living expenses, TROE, $15,000 year. 3. Dependence on family home for next 3 months. 4. Strained family relationships. 5. No transportation of my own. 6. Limited work experience, skills for higher paying jobs. A third page, unknown variables. Will parents cooperate with information request? 2. Status of original college fund, $62,000 according to last conversation with grandparents. 3. Vinny's business success, failure trajectory. 4. Additional scholarship opportunities. 5. Work-study options at Westridge. The exercise brought unexpected clarity. On paper, my situation wasn't hopeless. Challenging, certainly, but not insurmountable. The legal angle Sienna had introduced was the wild card. If my parents had truly breached their duty as custodians, it changed everything. But did I want to pursue that route? Going legal would permanently alter my relationship with my family. While our current tension was uncomfortable, an actual confrontation would be seismic. A knock at my bedroom door interrupted my thoughts. Madison? My grandmother's voice. Are you decent? I quickly closed my notebook. Come in, Grandma. My grandmother, Eleanor Wright, stepped into the room. At 72, she moved with the brisk energy of someone decades younger. Her silver hair was cut in a practical bob, and her eyes, the same hazel as mine, missed nothing. Your mother told me you're working too much, she said without preamble, and that you've become difficult. I couldn't help but smile. Grandma had never been one for beating around the bush. Is that why you're here? To tell me to be less difficult? She settled onto my bed with a snort. Please. If you're finally standing up for yourself, I'm here to applaud, not criticize. She fixed me with a shrewd look. Though I would like to know what prompted this evolution. I hesitated. My grandmother had always been my ally, but she was also fiercely protective of family harmony. Would she see my actions as disruptive rather than justified? Did Mom tell you about my college fund? I asked carefully. Grandma's expression darkened. She mentioned some financial reshuffling, was vague on the details. I took a deep breath and told her everything. The emptied account, the broken promises, Vinny's investment money, my discovery about 529 accounts. As I spoke, my grandmother's face grew increasingly still, a bad sign for anyone who knew her. When I finished, she was silent for a long moment. Your grandfather and I set up that account the day you were born, she finally said, her voice tight with controlled anger. $62,000 over 18 years, not for Gabriel and Judy to redistribute as they saw fit. Not for Vinny's business schemes. For your education? The confirmation sent a wave of vindication through me. So it was a 529 plan? Of course it was, she said, looking offended. We're not financial amateurs. Grandma, I said slowly, do you have the account? Information? The documentation? She raised an eyebrow. I was the backup custodian, Madison. I have copies of everything. My heart raced. Everything? Every statement? Every contribution? The original paperwork designating you as beneficiary. Her eyes narrowed. Why do you ask? I showed her the folder Millie had given me, explaining what I'd learned about custodial responsibilities. Grandma read the highlighted sections carefully, her expression hardening. When she looked up, there was a gleam in her eye I recognized from my own reflection. Determination. Well, she said, closing the folder, this changes things, doesn't it? I'm not sure I want to go legal, I admitted. They're still my parents. And you're still their daughter, she replied firmly. The child they were supposed to protect, not exploit. She reached for my hand. Information is power, Madison. You don't have to use it, but you should have it. She stood, smoothing her slacks with decisive motions. I'll bring you the documentation on Monday. In the meantime, focus on your scholarship meeting. At the door, she paused. One more thing. Your grandfather set aside a separate fund for emergency, educational expenses, $10,000 in a private account. It was meant to be a graduation surprise, but I think current circumstances qualify as an emergency. I stared at her, speechless. The money will be transferred to your account by Wednesday, she continued matter-of-factly. Don't tell your parents. And Madison? Her expression softened slightly. I'm proud of you. It takes courage to demand fairness, especially from those who should have offered it freely. After she left, I sat in stunned silence. Then I reopened my notebook and added to the assets page. Grandparents' documentation of 529 account 10. Emergency Education Fund, 10,000, 11. Grandma's support. The inventory had shifted dramatically in my favor. By the time I left for my meeting with Mrs. Henderson, I had reorganized my approach entirely. I no longer needed the desperation scholarships, the exhausting work schedule, the precarious loan arrangements. With my grandparents' support and the legal leverage of the 529 documentation, I had options I hadn't imagined possible hours earlier. The question was no longer whether I could afford college, but what kind of relationship I wanted with my parents, going forward. Did I force the issue of the misappropriated funds? Did I accept my grandmother's gift and move forward independently? Or did I use my newfound leverage to negotiate a new family dynamic? For the first time since receiving my acceptance letter, I felt the weight of financial panic lift from my shoulders. The path ahead wasn't clear, but it was no longer impossibly steep. As I walked into the library to meet Mrs. Henderson, I held my head higher. I wasn't just the capable one anymore. I was capable and empowered, and my parents were about to discover exactly what that meant. The meeting with Imogene Henderson was unlike any scholarship interview I'd experienced. Rather than focusing on my achievements or financial need, Mrs. Henderson, a retired mathematics professor with sharp eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, challenged me with complex problems, watching how I approached them. "It's not the answer. That interests me," she explained, "but the path you take to reach it." By the end of our 2-hour session, my hand cramped from writing equations, but Mrs. Henderson seemed pleased. "You have a rare talent, Madison," she said, collecting my work. "Not just for numbers, but for seeing connections others miss." She tapped the folder containing my solutions. "I'll be in touch by Wednesday." As promised, my grandmother arrived, Monday afternoon carrying a locked document case. She shooed away my mother's curious questions about her visit, just bringing Madison some old photos for a project, and followed me to my room. Once the door was closed, she placed the case on my desk and entered the combination. "Everything is organized chronologically," she explained, lifting the lid to reveal neatly labeled folders. Account establishment documents are in the red folder. The blue folders contain quarterly statements. The green folder has the tax documents. I lifted the red folder with reverent care. Inside was the original paperwork establishing the 529 plan, dated 2 weeks after my birth. My name was clearly listed as the beneficiary, with my parents as primary custodians and my grandmother as backup. "There's a specific provision," my grandmother pointed out, turning to the 3rd page. "The funds are explicitly designated for the higher education of Madison Eleanor Wright and cannot be reallocated to another beneficiary without written consent from both custodians and the backup custodian." "Both custodians," I repeated. "So Mom and Dad both had to agree." "And I would have had to approve any beneficiary change," she confirmed grimly, "which I most certainly did not." I flipped through the quarterly statements, tracking the growth of the account over 18 years. Regular contributions from my grandparents, occasional ones from my parents in the early years, compound interest gradually building the balance. The final statement, dated 4 months ago, showed a balance of 67 vats, 432 $19. "The next folder contains withdrawal records," my grandmother said quietly. The documents told the story clearly. 3 large withdrawals over 6 weeks, emptying the account entirely. Each withdrawal form bore both my parents' signatures, with the stated purpose marked as qualified educational expenses. "But it wasn't for educational expenses," I said, anger rising. "It was for Vinny's business." "Which makes it not just wrong, but potentially fraudulent," my grandmother replied. She removed a manila envelope from the bottom of the case. "This contains the information for the separate fund your grandfather established. It's an ordinary savings account with you as the beneficiary, so there aren't the same tax implications as the 529. The transfer to your account is already processed." I checked my banking app. There it was, $10,000 from E&E Wright Trust. "Grandma, I don't know how to thank you." She waved away my gratitude. "Your grandfather and I saved for your education because we believed in your potential. We're simply ensuring our investment reaches its intended recipient." Her eyes gleamed with determination. "Now, what's your plan?" I hesitated. "I'm still not sure. Going legal feels extreme." "Sometimes the threat of action is more effective than action itself," she observed. "You now have evidence of potential financial impropriety. You don't have to use it, but having it changes your position." After my grandmother left, I spent hours reviewing the documents, scanning key pages to create digital copies. With each piece of evidence I processed, my resolve strengthened. The next step was clear. I needed expert advice on how best to use this information. I texted Sienna, asking if her Aunt Millie could meet again. Then I organized the documents into 3 clear categories: proof of intent, the original 529 plan establishing me as beneficiary; proof of misuse, withdrawal forms marked for educational; expenses that went to Vinny's business. Proof of current financial impact, my college acceptance and costs. That evening, my phone chimed with an email from Mrs. Henderson. Dear Madison, I am pleased to inform you that the Henderson Mathematical Excellence Scholarship Committee has selected you as this year's recipient. The award of $5,000 per year will be renewable for up to 4 years, provided you maintain a 3.5 GPA in your mathematics coursework. Additionally, I have spoken with the mathematics department chair at Westridge University about your unique talents. They have expressed interest in offering you a department-specific research assistantship beginning in your first semester, an opportunity typically reserved for upperclassmen. This position would provide an additional $3,000 per semester in exchange for 10 hours of work weekly. Please contact me at your earliest convenience to discuss next steps. Warm regards, Imogene Henderson, PhD. I read the email twice, hardly believing the words. Not only had I received the scholarship, but Mrs. Henderson had secured me a position that would provide an additional $6,000 per year. With my grandmother's $10,000, the Henderson Scholarship, and the potential research assistantship, my financial gap had shrunk dramatically. I no longer needed my parents' cooperation to attend Westridge. I could make it work independently. This realization shifted something fundamental in my approach. I wasn't fighting for survival anymore. I was negotiating from a position of strength. The tea. Next morning, I received a text from Millie confirming she could meet Wednesday afternoon. I responded with my gratitude, then focused on preparing the questions I needed answered. What legal options existed regarding the misused 529 funds? What potential consequences might my parents face if this became a legal matter? What would a reasonable resolution look like outside of court? How should I approach the conversation with my parents? By Wednesday afternoon, I had compiled a comprehensive file containing all relevant documents, a timeline of events, and my list of questions. As I prepared to leave for my meeting with Millie, my mother intercepted me in the hallway. "Where are you going?" she asked, noticing my professional attire and document folder. "I have a meeting about a scholarship," I replied truthfully, if not completely. "You've been very secretive lately," she observed, a note of hurt in her voice. Met her gaze steadily. I've had to be. Something in my tone must have alarmed her because she reached for my arm. "Madison, is everything okay? You've been different since we told you about the college fund." I considered my words. Carefully. I'm becoming the person I need to be to secure my future, since no one else is doing it for me. Her face fell, but I didn't soften my stance. The time for placating was over. The time for truth, uncomfortable as it might be, had arrived. "We'll talk soon," I promised. "All of us. There are some things we need to discuss as a family." As I drove to Millie's office in the car Sienna had lent me, I felt a strange calm. The ammunition I'd gathered wasn't just about financial recourse, it was about truth, accountability, and fairness. Concepts that had been notably absent from my family's decision-making where Vinny was concerned. For the first time, I had the means to change that dynamic, and I intended to use it. My meeting with Millie proved more illuminating than I'd anticipated. After reviewing the documentation, she looked up with an expression that mixed professional restraint with unmistakable indignation. "This is textbook misappropriation," she said, tapping the withdrawal forms. "A 529 plan has very specific rules about qualified expenses. Business ventures are explicitly excluded." "What does that mean legally?" I asked. "It means your parents could face penalties from the IRS for non-qualified withdrawals, typically a 10% penalty plus income tax on the earnings portion. But more significantly, as custodians who violated the terms of the account, they could potentially face civil liability for breach of fiduciary duty." "I don't want to sue my parents," I clarified. Millie nodded. "Most of these situations resolve without litigation. Often, the demonstration that you understand your rights and have evidence of misconduct is enough to reach a reasonable settlement. I left with a clearer understanding of my position and a strategy for approaching my parents. The conversation needed to happen soon, but I wanted to be methodical, not reactive. When I arrived home, the house was unusually quiet. Typically, my father would be watching television in the living room, my mother preparing dinner. Instead, I found a note on the kitchen counter. Emergency meeting with Vinny's investors. Leftovers in the fridge. Don't wait up. Mom, I heated some leftovers and settled at the kitchen table with my homework, but found it difficult to concentrate. The empty house amplified the strange limbo I was living in. Physically present in my family home, but emotionally detached from the family itself. Around 9 p.m., the front door opened. Raised voices immediately filled the entryway. My father's, deep baritone, my mother's conciliatory tone, and Vinny's defensive protests. I stayed at the kitchen table, listening. "I don't understand how this happened," my father was saying, his voice tight with barely controlled anger. $750,000 doesn't just disappear in 2 weeks. The development costs were higher than projected, Vinny responded. Plus the licensing fees and— "Don't give me that bull," my father snapped. "We saw the expense reports. Personal purchases, Vinny. A new car, an apartment in the Marina District. What were you thinking?" My ears perked up. This was new information. It was all business-related, Vinny insisted. Image is important in tech. The investors expected their money to go toward product development, my father interrupted. Not your lifestyle upgrade. "Gabriel, please," my mother interjected. "Let's not make accusations. I'm sure there's an explanation." "That's what we always say," my father retorted. "There's always an explanation with Vinny, and somehow it's never his fault." Their voices moved toward the living room. I remained perfectly still, not wanting to alert them to my presence. "The investors are threatening legal action," my father continued, his voice slightly muffled now. "Do you understand what that means? Fraud investigations, financial audits. They'll want to know where every dollar went." "They're overreacting," Vinny said dismissively. "Every startup has cash flow challenges." "This isn't a cash flow challenge," my father countered. "This is misappropriation of funds. And if they go to the authorities—" "They won't," my mother interrupted. "We'll figure something out. We always do." A heavy silence followed. Then my father spoke, his voice subdued. "We've mortgaged the house twice for your ventures, Vinny. We've depleted our retirement savings. We even used Madison's college fund." "And I'll pay it all back," Vinny insisted. "Just as soon as—" "No," my father said, a finality in his tone I'd never heard before. "No more just as soon as. No more explanations. No more chances." "What are you saying?" My mother's voice was sharp with alarm. "I'm saying we're done," my father replied. "No more bailouts. No more excuses." "You can't be serious," Vinny protested. "You're my parents. You're supposed to support me." "Support doesn't mean enabling your worst instincts," my father said wearily. "We've failed you by making everything too easy. And we've failed Madison by making everything too hard." My breath caught. This was the first time I'd heard my father acknowledge the imbalance in how they'd treated us. "Gabriel, you're upset," my mother said soothingly. "We all are. Let's not make any hasty decisions." "It's not hasty," my father insisted. "I've been blind, but I'm seeing clearly now. We need to face reality. Vinny needs to face consequences." "So, what? You're just going to throw me to the wolves?" Vinny's voice rose. "Let the investors sue me? Let me go bankrupt?" "We'll help you find a lawyer," my father said. "But we won't cover this debt. We can't." A tense silence followed. Then Vinny spoke, his voice hard. "Fine. If that's how it's going to be, I'll solve this myself. I still have access to the family accounts." I'll transfer what I need to smooth things over with the investors. My blood ran cold. Was he threatening to drain their accounts the way they had drained mine? What family accounts? My mother asked. The joint checking, Vinny replied. Dad's emergency fund, the home equity line. You don't have access to those, my father said, but there was uncertainty in his voice. Don't I? Vinny's tone was smug. Mom made me a signatory on the joint account years ago, and I've got the login information for all your online banking. You guys use the same password for everything, I heard my mother gasp. Vinny, you wouldn't. Why not? He challenged. You've always taught me that family resources go to whoever needs them most. Well, right now, that's me. I'd heard enough. I stood and walked deliberately toward the living room, making no effort to hide my approach. The conversation halted, abruptly as I appeared in the doorway. 3 startled faces turned toward me, my father standing rigid by the fireplace, my mother perched anxiously on the edge of the sofa, and Vinny lounging in the armchair with a defiance that couldn't quite mask his desperation. Madison, my mother said, forcing brightness into her voice. We didn't know you were home. Clearly, I replied, my gaze fixed on Vinny. So the investors are suing because you misused their funds? That's interesting timing, considering our recent discussions about my college fund. Vinny shifted uncomfortably. This is a private family conversation. Is it? I stepped fully into the room. Because it sounds like you're threatening to steal from our parents the same way they stole from me. Madison, my mother exclaimed. That's not what happened, isn't it? I looked between my parents. You took money specifically saved for my education and gave it to Vinny. Money that wasn't yours to give. I turned back to Vinny. And now you're planning to take whatever's left without their permission. The pattern is pretty clear. The room fell silent, the tension palpable. Vinny glared at me, but beneath his anger I saw something else. Fear. My brother was cornered, and he knew it. You have no idea what you're talking about, he finally said, but his voice lacked conviction. Actually, I replied calmly, I understand perfectly. And so will the authorities when they investigate the investor fraud and start looking into all your financial activities, including what happened to my 529 plan. The silence that followed my statement about the 529 plan was deafening. My mother's face drained of color, my father's expression shifted from anger to confusion, and Vinny stared at me with narrowed eyes. What do you mean, authorities? My mother finally asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I've been doing some research, I said, maintaining my composure. About 529 education savings plans, about fiduciary responsibilities, about what happens when custodians of such accounts use the funds for non-qualified expenses. My father sank slowly onto the couch. Madison, we were going to replace that money. With what? I gestured toward Vinny. With the profits from his business? The one that just imploded? The one where he spent investor money on a luxury car and a Marina District apartment? Vinny stood abruptly. This is ridiculous. You're just trying to deflect attention from— I have copies of all the documentation, I interrupted calmly. The original account establishment, the quarterly statements, the withdrawal forms where you both signed, stating the money was for qualified educational expenses. I looked directly at my parents. That was a false statement. The money went to Vinny's business, which is explicitly not a qualified educational expense. You're bluffing, Vinny challenged. You don't have access to those records. Grandma does, I replied. Simply, she was the backup custodian. She kept copies of everything. My mother pressed her hand to her mouth. Eleanor gave you the documents? I nodded. She believes, as I do, that what happened was wrong, not just morally, but legally. Are you threatening us? Vinny demanded, stepping toward me. Your own family? I'm stating facts, I corrected him. and offering an opportunity to make things right before this becomes a legal matter. My father raised his head, looking at me with new eyes, not as his compliant daughter, but as someone to be reckoned with. "What do you want, Madison?" "A family meeting," I said. "Tomorrow evening, 7 p.m. I'll present a proposal for resolving this situation. Until then, I suggest nobody makes any financial transactions." I looked pointedly at Vinny, especially unauthorized ones. Without waiting for their response, I turned and walked back to my room, my heart hammering in my chest. I had never confronted my family so directly before. Part of me felt guilty for the shock on my mother's face, the defeat in my father's posture. But a stronger part felt vindicated. For the first time, they were seeing the consequences of their choices, and the strength of the daughter they had underestimated. I called my grandmother immediately. "It's done," I told her. I confronted them. "Family meeting tomorrow night." "How did they react?" she asked. "Shocked, defensive, then subdued." I hesitated. Vinny was threatening to drain their accounts. He's in trouble with his investors. Fraud, maybe. My grandmother sighed heavily. "I was afraid of this. Your grandfather warned Gabriel years ago that his enabling would lead to disaster." "Will you come tomorrow?" I asked. I could use the support. "Absolutely," she replied without hesitation. "I'll bring the original documents. And Madison?" Her voice softened. "I'm proud of you. Standing up to family is the hardest thing to do, especially when they've conditioned you to put yourself last." After we hung up, I texted Sienna with an update, then began preparing for tomorrow's meeting. This wasn't just about reclaiming my money. It was about recalibrating our entire family dynamic. I created a presentation folder with 3 sections: the problem, documentation of the 529 plan, its intended purpose, and the improper withdrawals; the impact, my college acceptance, the financial gap, and the consequences of not having the promised funds; the solution, my proposed resolution, terms, that would allow us to move forward without legal action. By morning, I had finished my preparations. I felt strangely calm as I got ready for school, despite the tension that hung over our house like a storm cloud. My parents moved around each other in awkward silence, avoiding my eyes when we passed in the hallway. Vinny was nowhere to be seen, likely hiding in the basement apartment. At school, I met briefly with Ms. Reynolds, updating her on the Henderson Scholarship and expressing my gratitude for her nomination. "I knew Imogene would recognize your potential," she said warmly. "The research assistantship is particularly impressive. First-semester freshmen are never offered those positions." "It's a game changer," I admitted. "Along with some other developments, I think I'll be able to attend Westridge without taking on significant debt." Her eyes brightened with interest. "Other developments?" I hesitated, then decided to be partially honest. "My grandparents had set aside additional funds I wasn't aware of, and I've been working extra shifts at the bookstore." She nodded approvingly. "You've always been resourceful, Madison. It's one of your greatest strengths." "I used to think of it as a necessity," I replied, "but I'm starting to see it differently now." By the time I returned home that afternoon, the atmosphere had shifted palpably. My parents were sitting together at the kitchen table, heads bent over paperwork. They looked up when I entered, their expressions a mixture of wariness and resignation. "Madison," my father began, "before tonight's meeting, we want you to know we've been looking at our finances. I held up a hand. "I'd prefer we discuss everything with Grandma present." "As agreed." He nodded slowly. "All right, but I want you to know we're taking this seriously." My mother's eyes were red-rimmed, whether from tears or lack of sleep, I couldn't tell. "We never meant to hurt you," she said softly. I didn't respond. Good intentions didn't erase the impact of their actions. They would need to demonstrate real understanding and change, not just remorse. I retreated to my room to review my presentation one final time. At 6:30, I heard the doorbell. Being my grandmother arriving early as was her habit, I allowed myself a small smile. The stage was set. By 6:55, we were assembled in the living room, my parents on the sofa, my grandmother in the armchair, Vinny slouched against the wall, and me standing by the fireplace with my presentation folder, open on the mantel. "Is this really necessary?" Vinny muttered. "The dramatic family summit?" "Yes," my grandmother replied crisply. "It is. And you would do well to listen more than you speak tonight, Vincent." At exactly 7 p.m., I cleared my throat and addressed my family, my voice steadier than I had expected. "Thank you for being here. I've called this meeting to address the misappropriation of my college fund and to propose a path forward that avoids legal complications while ensuring my educational future is secure." I opened the folder to the first section. Let's begin with the facts. As I laid out the evidence, I watched their faces, my mother's growing dismay, my father's grim acceptance, Vinny's thinly veiled hostility. But most importantly, I felt my own power growing with each documented fact, each clear statement of impact, each reasonable term in my proposed solution. This was no longer about being the good daughter or the capable one. This was about justice, about boundaries, about ensuring that the pattern that had dominated our family for years, Vinny's needs first, everyone else's second, was finally broken, and I was the one breaking it. As you can see from these documents, I continued, pointing to the account, statements spread before them. The 529 plan established by Grandma and Grandpa contained $67,432.19 as of 4 months ago. 3 withdrawals were made in succession, completely emptying the account. I placed the withdrawal forms on the coffee table one by one, like evidence at a trial. "Each withdrawal form was signed by both of you," I said, looking at my parents, "with the stated purpose being qualified educational expenses. But the money didn't go to education at all. It went to Vinny's business venture." "Madison," my mother interjected, "you have to understand." "Let her finish, Judy," my grandmother said firmly. I nodded gratefully at her before continuing. "I've consulted with a financial advisor about this situation. The misuse of 529 funds constitutes both a tax violation and a breach of fiduciary duty. The penalties could include fines from the IRS, plus potential civil liability." My father's face had grown increasingly ashen as I spoke. "We didn't realize. We thought since we were the custodians." "Custodians have legal obligations," I explained. "The money wasn't yours to repurpose, even if you were the ones managing it." Vinny pushed away from the wall, his posture defensive. "So what are you saying? You're going to report our parents to the IRS, have them investigated, all because you're jealous that they tried to help me for once?" I fixed him with a level gaze. "For once? Our parents have been rescuing you from your own decisions for years. They've mortgaged their home twice. They've depleted their retirement savings. And now they've taken my college fund, all to support your failed ventures." "My business would have succeeded if what?" I interrupted. "If you hadn't spent investor money on a new car and luxury apartment, if you hadn't mismanaged the company into the ground in just 2 weeks, if Mom and Dad had given you even more money?" "That's not fair," my mother protested weakly. "No, it isn't fair," my grandmother agreed, surprising everyone. "But not in the way you mean, Judy." She leaned forward, her expression stern. "What isn't fair is how you and Gabriel have consistently sacrificed Madison's needs for Vincent's wants. What isn't fair is teaching one child that responsibility is punished, while teaching the other that irresponsibility is rewarded." The room fell silent. My grandmother rarely spoke so directly, and when she did, everyone listened. "We were trying to be good parents to both of them," my father said after a long moment, his voice strained. "By stealing from one to give to the other?" my grandmother challenged. "We didn't think of it that way," my mother insisted. "We truly Believed Vinny's business would succeed, that he would pay it back before Madison needed it. And now? I asked quietly. Now that his business has failed, the investors are threatening legal action, and I still need to pay for college. What's your plan? My parents exchanged uncomfortable glances. It was clear they had no plan. That's what I thought, I said, opening the third section of my presentation, which is why I've prepared a proposal for resolving this situation. I handed copies to each of them. A detailed document outlining terms for repayment, accountability measures, and conditions for avoiding legal action. I'm not interested in punishing anyone, I explained as they scanned the pages. I'm interested in justice and in securing my future. My proposal has 3 main components. I ticked them off on my fingers. First, a formal acknowledgement that the 529 funds were improperly used, with a signed agreement to repay the full amount over time. I looked directly at my parents. This protects you from potential legal consequences while ensuring I receive what was intended for me. My father nodded slowly, relief evident in his expression. Second, a restructuring of family financial arrangements. I took a deep breath. No more bailouts for Vinny. No more draining family resources for his ventures. He needs to face the consequences of his choices, just as I've had to face the consequences of yours. That's not your decision to make, Vinny snapped. Actually, my grandmother interjected, it's a perfectly reasonable boundary, one that should have been established long ago. And third, I continued, ignoring Vinny's glare, transparent communication about all family finances going forward. No more secrets. No more surprise diversion of funds intended for one purpose to another. I closed my folder, my heart racing despite my outwardly calm demeanor. Those are my terms. They're fair, they're reasonable, and they give everyone a path forward without legal repercussions. The silence that followed was heavy with tension. My mother was the first to speak. Madison, while I appreciate the thoroughness of your proposal, this feels very transactional. We're family. Being family didn't stop you from taking what was mine, I replied evenly. Why should it stop me from ensuring it's returned? But the repayment schedule, my father said, flipping to the second page. We can't possibly afford these monthly amounts not with our current obligations. You mean like the mortgage you took out to fund Vinny's last failed business? I asked, my voice still calm but edged with steel. Or the credit card debt from bailing him out before that? Those obligations? My father flinched. Madison, please try to understand our position. I understand your position perfectly, I said. For years, you've prioritized Vinny's desires over my needs, over your own needs. You've enabled his bad decisions while expecting me to silently accept whatever scraps were left over. That ends. Now! Vinny slammed his hand on the side table. This is ridiculous. You've got them cowering like they've committed some crime, when all they did was try to help me get my business off the ground. With money that wasn't theirs to give, my grandmother reminded him sharply. Oh, stay out of this, Grandma! Vinny snapped. You've always favored Madison anyway. My grandmother's eyebrows shot up. I've favored responsibility and honesty, qualities you could stand to develop, Vincent. Before Vinny could retort, I raised my hand. Let's stay focused. The issue isn't who's favored. The issue is that a significant amount of money designated for my education was diverted without proper authority. I'm offering a solution that avoids legal consequences while making things right. I turned to my parents. You have a choice to make. Either agree to these terms, or I'll be forced to pursue other options to secure what's rightfully mine. My father looked up from the proposal, his expression a mixture of resignation and newfound respect. You're serious about this? Completely, I confirmed. And if we refuse? My mother asked quietly. I met her gaze steadily. Then on Monday, Grandma and I have an appointment with her attorney to discuss filing a formal complaint for breach of fiduciary duty, followed by a report to the IRS regarding the misuse of 529 funds. The shock on my parents' faces was palpable. They had never expected their compliant, understanding daughter to stand so firmly against them, to choose justice over family harmony. "You wouldn't," my mother whispered. "I don't want to," I corrected her. "But I will if necessary." My father looked at the proposal again, then at my grandmother, who nodded almost imperceptibly. "We'll need time to review this," he finally said. "You have until Sunday evening," I replied. "Our appointment is Monday morning." With that, the power dynamic in our family shifted irrevocably. For the first time, my parents were facing the consequences of their choices, and I was the one setting the terms. The morning after our confrontation, a heavy silence pervaded our home. My parents moved through their routines mechanically, exchanging few words and avoiding my eyes. Vinny had disappeared, presumably to lick his wounds elsewhere. I received a text from Sienna. "How did it go?" I replied simply, "They have until Sunday to accept my terms." My grandmother called shortly after breakfast. "How are you feeling?" she asked. "Strangely calm," I admitted. "I expected to feel guilty or anxious, but I don't." "That's because you're in the right," she said matter-of-factly. "When you know your position is just, it gives you a foundation that emotion can't easily shake." Around noon, my father knocked on my bedroom door. His face was drawn, his shoulders slumped with the weight of sleepless contemplation. "Can we talk?" he asked. I nodded, gesturing to my desk chair while I sat on the edge of my bed. He sat heavily, running a hand through his hair. "Your mother and I have been discussing your proposal all night." He paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. "We want to make things right, Madison. We do. But the repayment schedule you've outlined, it's just not feasible for us right now. Because of your financial commitments to Vinny," I clarified. He didn't deny it. "We're overextended. The second mortgage, the credit card debt, our depleted savings. We're barely staying afloat as it is." I maintained my composure. "That's the result of choices you made, Dad. Choices that prioritized Vinny's wants over everyone else's needs, including your own." He flinched but didn't argue. "You're right. We've enabled him for too long, made excuses, hoped that the next venture would be the one that turned things around." He sighed deeply. "But we can't change the past. We can only try to move forward." "My proposal is about moving forward," I said. "It's about accountability and making things right." "We want to make things right," he insisted. "But we need a more realistic time frame. The monthly payments you're asking for, we simply don't have that kind of cash flow." I considered this. I had intentionally set the bar high, knowing there would be negotiation. "What can you manage?" I asked. "We could start with smaller payments now, increasing over time as we restructure our finances." He hesitated. "And we've made a decision about Vinny. No more financial support. He needs to stand on his own." I raised an eyebrow, skeptical. "You've said that before." "This time it's different," my father said, his voice firmer than I'd heard in years. "Your presentation last night, seeing all the evidence laid out like that, it forced us to confront the pattern we've created. The damage we've done. Not just to you, but to Vinny too. We've crippled him by never letting him face consequences." This was unexpected, my father acknowledging not just the unfairness to me, but the disservice they'd done to Vinny through their enabling. "What about Mom?" I asked. "Is she on board with cutting off Vinny's support?" My father hesitated. "She's struggling with it, but she agrees it's necessary. Your grandmother had a long talk with her this morning." Of course she did. Grandma had always been the family's moral compass, the one person whose judgment even my mother wouldn't dismiss. "I need to see more than promises," I said after a moment. "I need concrete action and a formal agreement." My father nodded. "We understand. We're prepared to sign a legally binding repayment plan. And we've already contacted the bank to remove Vinny as a signatory on all our accounts. That surprised me. It was a tangible step, one that demonstrated they were serious about changing the family's financial dynamics. What about the investor situation? I asked. Is Vinny facing legal trouble? My father's expression darkened. It's serious. They're alleging misappropriation of funds and considering pressing charges. Vinny admits he used company money for personal expenses, but claims it was just getting ahead of his eventual salary. Typical. Vinny, reframing theft as an advance he deserved. Will you bail him out of that too? I challenged. No, my father said firmly. We'll help him find legal representation, but we won't pay his debts or legal fees. He created this mess. He needs to find his way out of it. I studied my father, looking for signs of the familiar wavering that always preceded another Vinny bailout, but his eyes held a new resolve. Here's what I'm willing to adjust, I said, reaching for a notebook. I'll extend the repayment timeline from 3 years to 5, reducing the monthly amounts. But I need the first 6 months' payments up front as a show of good faith. My father looked startled. Up front? Madison, that's non-negotiable, I finished. I need to secure my first year at Westridge. I need to know that when I leave for college, the foundation is solid. After everything that's happened, I need more than promises. He hesitated, then nodded slowly. I understand. We'll find a way. One more thing, I said, my voice steady. I want a formal apology from both you and Mom, acknowledging what happened and why it was wrong. Not just to satisfy me, but because I need to know you truly understand the impact of your actions. My father's eyes glistened with unshed tears. You'll have it. We've failed you, Madison. I've failed you. As a parent, my job was to protect your future, not jeopardize it for your brother's benefit. He took a shaky breath. I'm so sorry. The simple apology, delivered without excuses or qualifications, loosened something tight in my chest. It wasn't everything. Formal agreements still needed to be signed, payments secured, boundaries established, but it was a start. Thank you, I said quietly. As my father rose to leave, I added, What about Vinny? Will he apologize too? My father's expression turned grim. I don't know. He's struggling to accept the new reality, but that's his journey now, not ours to manage. After he left, I sat for a long time, processing what had just occurred. The line had been drawn, the terms established. For the first time, I wasn't accommodating my family's dysfunction. They were accommodating my requirements for justice. I texted my grandmother. Dad agreed to modified terms. First steps looking promising. Her response came quickly. Hold firm on the essentials. Bend only where it doesn't compromise your security. Wise as always. The boundary I had established wasn't just about money. It was about respect, about fairness, about my worth in the family equation. And for once, that equation was balancing in my favor. The weekend unfolded in a series of tense negotiations and revelations. My mother finally came to speak with me Saturday morning, her eyes red-rimmed from crying. Your father told me about your conversation, she began, perching awkwardly on my desk chair. About the adjusted repayment plan. I nodded but said nothing, waiting for her to continue. I want you to know, she said, twisting her wedding ring nervously, that I never meant for any of this to happen. I truly believed we were doing what was best for the family. By taking from me to give to Vinny, I kept my voice neutral. She flinched. When you put it that way, it sounds terrible. How would you put it? My mother stared at her hands. I don't know anymore. For so long, I've justified our decisions as helping the child who needed it most. But now I see that we weren't helping Vinny at all. We were enabling him, and we were hurting you in the process. It was the closest thing to self-awareness I'd ever heard from my mother regarding Vinny. He's spiraling, she continued quietly. Since your meeting, since we told him we can't bail him out of the investor situation, he's angry. Lashing out, accusing us of abandoning him. That's manipulation, I pointed out. He's trying to make you feel guilty for setting a boundary. She nodded slowly. I know. I can see it now. But it's still hard to hear my child say, I've failed him. You've been hearing your other child say that for weeks, I reminded her gently. The difference is, I'm asking for what's rightfully mine, while Vinny is demanding what belongs to others. Tears spilled down her cheeks. You're right. And I'm so sorry, Madison. Sorry for taking what was yours. Sorry for making you feel less important. Sorry for not seeing your strength as something to celebrate rather than exploit. The apology, like my father's, seemed genuine. But words needed to be backed by actions. What about the repayment plan? I asked. Dad said you're struggling to make the first 6 months' payments up front. She nodded. We are, but we're committed to finding a way. She hesitated. Your father is selling his car. It won't cover the full amount, but it's a start. I blinked in surprise. My father loved his car, a vintage Mustang he had restored himself. Over several years. That he would sell it to make things right with me was unexpected. And I've picked up extra shifts at the hospital, she continued. We're both doing what we can to make this right. By Sunday evening, my parents had presented a revised agreement that largely matched my requirements. They had secured half of the 6-month upfront payment, with a concrete plan for delivering the rest within 30 days. They had signed a formal acknowledgement of their misuse of the 529 funds, and they had provided documentation showing they had removed Vinny as a signatory from all family accounts, but Vinny himself was nowhere to be found. He had stormed out after a heated argument with my father on Saturday and hadn't returned. He'll come around, my mother said, though her expression betrayed her uncertainty. He just needs time to adjust to the new reality. Monday brought the first real test of my parents' commitment. My grandmother and I had kept our appointment with her attorney, not to file a complaint since my parents had agreed to terms, but to have the repayment agreement reviewed and formalized. This looks comprehensive, the attorney, a sharp-eyed woman named Ms. Parker, commented as she reviewed the document. The acknowledgement of improper use of 529 funds, the repayment schedule, the consequences for default. Your parents have agreed to all this? Yes, I confirmed. They've signed the preliminary version and made the first partial payment. Ms. Parker looked impressed. Usually these family financial disputes are much messier. You've handled this remarkably well. I glanced at my grandmother, who smiled approvingly. As we left the law office, my phone buzzed with a text from Sienna. Check your social media, now. I opened Instagram to find my direct messages flooded with concerned notes from friends and classmates. It took only moments to discover why. Vinny had posted a lengthy diatribe on his profile, tagging me and several mutual connections, my own sister blackmailing our parents, threatening legal action, over money that was used to help family in need. She has everything: scholarships, academic achievements, a perfect future. But she can't stand that attention, and resources went to someone else for once. The post continued, painting me as cruel and selfish, my parents as victims of my greed, and himself as the misunderstood entrepreneur whose only crime was dreaming too big. What garbage, my grandmother muttered, reading over my shoulder. Classic Darvo: deny, attack, reverse victim and offender. But the damage was spreading. Distant relatives were commenting, friends were taking sides. The private family matter had become painfully public. When we arrived home, the situation had escalated further. My mother sat at the kitchen table, her face pale as she stared at her phone. The investors filed charges, she said as we entered, against Vinny, for fraud and misappropriation of funds. My stomach dropped. Despite everything, I hadn't wanted things to go this far. What happens now? They're looking for him, she said hollowly. There's a warrant out. Gabriel is trying to convince him to turn himself in. Will he? My grandmother asked. My mother shook her head helplessly. I don't know. He's not answering calls, and he's emptied his apartment, the one he rented with. Investor money. The cascade had begun. What started with my college fund had expanded to reveal a pattern of financial impropriety that now threatened Vinny's freedom. My parents' enabling had finally reached its inevitable conclusion, legal consequences that they couldn't shield him from. That evening, as I worked on homework at my desk, a notification appeared on my laptop, an email from Westridge University. Dear Madison, we are pleased to inform you that based on your exceptional academic achievements and the recommendation of Mrs. Imogene Henderson, the mathematics department has approved an increase in your research assistantship stipend from $3,000 to $4,500 per semester. The timing was almost poetic. As one door in my life threatened to close, another opened wider. With this increased stipend, combined with my grandmother's fund, the Henderson Scholarship, and the partial repayment from my parents, my first year at Westridge was now fully secured. I forwarded the email to my grandmother with a simple message. No matter what happens with Vinny, I'm going to be okay. Her response came quickly. You were always going to be okay, Madison. The difference now is that everyone else knows it too. As the week progressed, the consequences continued to unfold. Vinny remained missing, though sightings placed him in a neighboring state. The investor's case gained media attention when it emerged that several other young entrepreneurs had been similarly defrauded. My parents, true to their word, delivered the second part of the upfront payment by selling my father's car and liquidating a small investment account. The family that had once revolved around Vinny's needs and dramas was being forcibly restructured, not by my actions alone, but by the natural consequences of years of enabling and avoidance. And in the midst of it all, I stood firm, neither gloating nor retreating. This wasn't what I had wanted, but it was perhaps what we had all needed. Vinny's social media attack on me had an unexpected effect. It mobilized support from quarters I hadn't anticipated. By Wednesday morning, the narrative had begun to shift, as people who knew both of us weighed in. My calculus study group created a private fund to help with my textbooks for college. My debate team coach, Mr. Winters, emailed to offer me a paid position tutoring high school students over the summer. Even my mother's sister, Aunt Kelly, who had always been Vinny's staunchest defender, called to express her support. I saw Vincent's post, she said when I answered her call. And then I spoke with your grandmother. I had no idea about the college fund, Madison. If I'd known— It's okay, Aunt Kelly, I assured her. It's being handled now. Well, I want to help, she insisted. I've spoken with your Uncle Mickey, and we'd like to contribute to your education. Nothing extravagant, but enough to cover your meal plan for the first year. I was momentarily speechless. Aunt Kelly had 5 children of her own, all approaching college age. That she would offer financial support despite her own obligations was touching. That's incredibly generous, I finally managed. But you don't have to— We want to, she interrupted firmly. Family supports family. That's supposed to be the point, isn't it? Not just bailing out the same person over and over, but lifting each other up when it matters. Her words resonated deeply. This was what family should be. Mutual support, not one-sided sacrifice. That afternoon, Sienna's mother Judy called, asking if I would join them for dinner that evening. When I arrived at their home, I found not just Sienna's family but also her Aunt Millie and Mrs. Henderson. A strategy session, Sienna explained with a grin as she ushered me into their dining room. Team Madison assembles. Over a meal of lasagna and garlic bread, these women who had become my support network discussed the ongoing situation with practical clarity. The legal aspects are well in hand with the repayment agreement, Millie observed. But there's still the matter of Vincent's public accusations. I'm not concerned about those, I said, though in truth, the public nature of Vinny's attack had been hurtful. People who know me won't believe him. It's not about belief, Mrs. Henderson countered, her academic precision evident even in casual conversation. It's about narrative control. Your brother has attempted to reframe the situation to vilify you. That requires a response, not defensive, but factual. What are you suggesting? I asked. Not a counterattack, Judy said quickly. That would only escalate things. But perhaps a simple statement of facts, transparent, dignified, and brief. They were right. While I had been focused on the legal and financial resolution, Vinny had been shaping public perception. His version of a privileged sister cruelly punishing struggling family members needed correction. With their guidance, I drafted a simple post to address recent characterizations of a private family matter. 4 months ago, my college fund, established by my grandparents for my education, was emptied without my knowledge or consent to fund my brother's business venture. After discovering this, I worked with family members to establish a repayment plan, which my parents have honorably begun fulfilling. I'm grateful for their willingness to make things right, and for the tremendous support I've received from family, friends, and educators. I will not be commenting further on this private matter and ask for understanding as our family works through this challenging time. I showed the draft to the women gathered around the table. After a few minor edits, I posted it to my social media accounts. Now, about your housing situation, Millie said, seamlessly moving to the next concern. Does it make sense for you to continue living at home until you leave for college? I hadn't considered this question. Despite the progress with my parents, home remained tense. Vinny's disappearance had left my mother anxious and distracted. My father was working extra hours to cover the repayment plan, and there was always the possibility that Vinny might return, bringing his volatility with him. You're welcome to stay with us, Sienna offered immediately. My room's big enough for both of us. It would be like a pre-college roommate trial run. Or, Mrs. Henderson interjected, I have a guest apartment above my garage. It's small but private, and I could use some help cataloging my library this summer. I'd consider it an even exchange, housing for assistance. Their offers touched me deeply. Just weeks ago, I had felt entirely alone in my struggle. Now I had options, support, advocates. I should probably stay home for now, I said after consideration. My parents are making genuine efforts to repair our relationship. Moving out might send the wrong message. Judy nodded approvingly. A mature decision, but keep these options in your back pocket. Everyone needs an exit strategy. As the evening wound down, Mrs. Henderson pulled me aside. Madison, there's something else you should know. The mathematics department chair was quite impressed by your credentials. He's suggested you might be a candidate for the accelerated master's program. My eyes widened. But that's typically only offered to juniors and seniors. Typically, she agreed with a small smile. But there are always exceptions for exceptional students. It would mean taking graduate-level courses alongside your undergraduate requirements. Challenging, but it would position you for remarkable opportunities after graduation. The implications were enormous. The accelerated master's would essentially give me a graduate degree in 5 years instead of 6, opening doors to prestigious PhD programs or high-level industry positions. Think about it, Mrs. Henderson advised. We can discuss the details when you're ready. As I drove home that evening, I marveled at how much had changed in just a few weeks. What had begun as a desperate scramble to fund my education had expanded into a network of support and opportunity that exceeded anything I could have imagined. My phone buzzed with notifications, responses to my post. Unlike the division caused by Vinny's accusations, my simple statement was being met with overwhelming support. Former teachers, distant relatives, even a few of Vinny's former business associates were commenting with messages of encouragement and, in some cases, sharing similar experiences of family financial boundaries being crossed. By standing up for myself, I had inadvertently created space for others to speak their truths as well. When I arrived home, I found my mother waiting up for me, a cup of tea growing cold in her hands. "I saw your post," she said quietly. "It was fair. More than fair, actually." I nodded, setting my bag down. "I didn't want to escalate things, just clarify." "Your father and I have been talking," she continued, "about everything that's happened, about how we got here." She looked up, her eyes tired but clear. "We're trying to understand our part in all this, not just with the college fund, but with the years of imbalance." She hesitated. "We'd like to go to family therapy, if you're willing, to work on rebuilding trust." It was the last thing I had expected. My mother, who had always insisted our family was just fine, suggesting professional help. It was perhaps the strongest indicator yet that real change might be possible. "I'd be open to that," I said carefully. She smiled, relief evident in her expression. "Thank you." She stood, gathering her courage. "There's one more thing. The police called this evening. They've located Vinny." "They've located Vinny." My mother's words hung in the air between us. "Where?" I asked, setting my bag down. "A motel just outside Portland. The manager recognized him from a news report about the investor fraud case." She twisted her hands together. "They've taken him into custody." The news landed with a strange mix of emotions: relief that he was safe, satisfaction that he was facing consequences, but also a complicated grief for what this meant for our family. "What happens now?" I asked. "He'll be brought back to face charges. Your father's contacting attorneys." She looked at me with uncertainty. "This is going to become very public, Madison. The investors are high profile. The local business journal is already running stories." I nodded slowly. "I understand. The thing is," she continued hesitantly, "the authorities may want to speak with all of us. About the pattern of financial support, about the college fund. They're building a case about Vinny's history of financial mismanagement. The implications were clear. Our family's private financial dealings, including what had happened with my college fund, might become part of the public record. The very thing I had tried to handle discreetly could become fodder for news stories and court documents." "I'll tell the truth," I said simply. "That's all I can do." My mother nodded, looking both proud and terrified. "Of course. That's the right thing." By morning, the news of Vinny's arrest had broken across local media. The story was gaining traction not just because of the investor fraud, but because of Vinny's social media posts attacking me, which reporters had quickly discovered and incorporated into their narrative. Entrepreneur arrested for fraud after. Family dispute over college fund millennial business owner accused of misusing investor funds after history of family bailouts. College fund controversy leads to larger fraud discovery. The headlines were surreal. Our private family matter had indeed become very public, but not in the way Vinny had intended when he posted his accusations. Instead of painting me as the villain, the media was framing Vinny as an entitled fraudster whose pattern of financial misconduct had finally caught up with him. At school, the attention was uncomfortable. Classmates approached with a mixture of curiosity and concern. Teachers gave me understanding nods. The guidance counselor, Mr. Evans, pulled me aside to check. If I needed any support, "I'm okay," I assured him. "It's not how I wanted things to play out, but I'm managing." "You've handled a difficult situation with remarkable maturity," he observed. "Many students would have crumbled under this kind of pressure." By lunchtime, my phone was buzzing constantly with messages from people I barely knew, seeking details or offering support. I turned it off, seeking a moment of peace in the library. Sienna found me there, sliding into the seat across from me with her usual directness. "So, your brother's on the news." "Apparently," I sighed. "How are you really feeling about all this?" she asked. I considered the question carefully. Conflicted. I wanted accountability, not public humiliation. For him or for my parents. You didn't cause this, Sienna reminded me. Vinny's actions did. All you did was stand up for yourself. I know, but it's still my family in the spotlight. She reached across the table to squeeze my hand. This will pass, and when it does, you'll still be the amazing, resilient person who refused to let others determine your worth. After school, I drove directly to my grandmother's house, seeking the calm wisdom that had guided me through this turbulent time. I found her in her garden, methodically deadheading roses as if the morning's news explosion had never happened. "I've been expecting you," she said without looking up. "The media circus must be overwhelming." "It's not what I wanted," I admitted, sinking onto the garden bench. "Of course not," she agreed, finally turning to face me. "You wanted private resolution, justice without spectacle. But Vincent chose a different path when he decided to make public accusations against you. Do you think he knew this would happen? That his investor fraud would be discovered?" My grandmother considered this, removing her gardening gloves. "I think Vincent has spent his entire life believing he could outsmart consequences. That pattern of thinking doesn't change overnight." She sat beside me, her expression grave but gentle. "The public verdict is being rendered, Madison. Not just on Vincent's actions, but on the family dynamics that enabled them. It's uncomfortable, even painful, but perhaps it's necessary." "Necessary how?" "Sometimes," she said carefully, "family dysfunction thrives in privacy. The secrecy, the unspoken agreements to maintain imbalance, they can only persist when hidden from outside view." She patted my hand. "The public nature of this situation makes it impossible for anyone to deny what happened or return to old patterns." Her words resonated deeply. The public exposure, uncomfortable as it was, had cemented the changes in our family. There could be no backsliding now, no quiet return to enabling Vinny at others' expense. Later that evening, as I worked on homework at my desk, my father knocked on my door. His face was drawn with exhaustion, but his eyes were clearer than I'd seen them in months. "We met with Vinny's attorney today," he began without preamble. "The situation is serious. He's facing multiple charges: fraud, misuse of investor funds, potentially even tax evasion." I nodded, waiting for him to continue. "He asked us to mortgage the house again, to post his bail and pay for his legal defense." My father's voice was flat, emotionless. We said no. The simple statement represented a seismic shift. My parents, who had never denied Vinny anything, had finally drawn a line. "How did he take it?" I asked. "Not well," my father admitted. "He accused us of abandoning him when he needs us most. Said if we were willing to make things right with you, we should do the same for him. But the situations aren't comparable," I pointed out. "No," my father agreed. "They're not. You asked us to return what was rightfully yours. Vincent is asking us to protect him from the consequences of his actions. We finally understand the difference." As he turned to leave, he paused at the door. "The media attention, I know it's difficult, but in a strange way, it's been clarifying. Seeing our family dynamics described by outsiders, it's forced us to confront how unhealthy things had become." After he left, I opened my laptop and, despite my better judgment, began reading the news coverage. Most stories followed predictable narratives, but one local reporter had dug deeper, interviewing Vinny's former business partners and employees. Their accounts painted a consistent picture: a charismatic but reckless entrepreneur who viewed other people's money as his personal resource, who blamed failures on external factors, who expected constant bailouts and second chances. One quote from a former colleague stood out: "Vincent Wright operated as if the normal rules didn't apply to him." When confronted about financial discrepancies, he would act shocked that anyone would question his integrity. But the pattern was clear to everyone except, apparently, his family. Seeing our family dynamics analyzed by strangers was surreal, but the reporter had captured an essential truth. The public verdict wasn't just about Vinny's legal troubles. It was an indictment of the ecosystem that had allowed his behavior to flourish unchecked for so long. And like it or not, that verdict was forcing a reckoning that private confrontation alone might never have achieved. The weeks following Vinny's arrest were a time of quiet rebuilding for our family. As the media attention gradually shifted to other stories, we began the difficult work of establishing new patterns and expectations. My parents, true to their word, attended their first family therapy session. They invited me to join them for the second one, where a calm, insightful therapist named Dr. Reyes helped us navigate difficult conversations about trust, fairness, and moving forward. Recovery from financial betrayal isn't just about repaying money, she explained during one session. It's about rebuilding the trust that was broken when resources were diverted without consent. My mother, who had initially been defensive in our sessions, began to show genuine understanding. I never saw it as betrayal, she admitted. I saw it as helping one child and assuming the other would understand, but that assumption itself was unfair to Madison. Each honest conversation laid another brick in the foundation of our new relationship, one built on respect rather than expectation, on boundaries rather than blind accommodation. Financially, things were stabilizing as well. My parents had restructured their debt, cutting up credit cards and creating a strict budget that prioritized their repayment obligation to me. The first 3 monthly payments arrived in my account precisely on schedule. My grandmother, ever practical, helped me establish a separate college expense account where all funds, the repayments from my parents, the Henderson scholarship money, my grandmother's gift, the contributions from Aunt Kelly and Uncle Mickey, were consolidated and carefully managed. Financial independence isn't just about having money, she advised. It's about managing it wisely and transparently. Meanwhile, my own preparations for college continued. I registered for my first semester courses at Westridge, selecting a balanced mix that included the advanced mathematics classes Mrs. Henderson had recommended for the accelerated master's track. Sienna and I finalized our housing arrangements, selecting a room in the newer dormitory with a small study alcove that would accommodate my research work. We spent weekends shopping for coordinating bedding, comparing desk lamps, and debating the necessity of a mini fridge. These normal, joyful preparations for the next chapter felt like a victory in themselves, proof that despite the family upheaval, my path forward remained clear and attainable. The most profound rebuilding, however, happened in the quiet moments with my parents. My father, who had spent years deferring to my mother on family decisions, began expressing his own views more confidently. "I've been thinking," he said one evening as we worked together in the garden, "about how I failed you by not speaking up when I knew things weren't right. I let your mother's emotional responses to Vinny override my own judgment, and that wasn't fair to anyone. Not to you, not to our family finances, and ultimately not to Vinny either." My mother, too, was making efforts. She had started consulting me about financial decisions that affected the family. A small but significant acknowledgement of my maturity and stake in our shared resources. "We're thinking of refinancing the mortgage," she told me one Saturday morning. "The lower interest rate would help us meet our repayment obligations to you more easily. What do you think?" These moments of inclusion, of having my opinion sought and valued, represented a fundamental shift in how they viewed me. Not as the child who needed less because she was capable, but as a full and equal member of the family whose needs and perspectives mattered. Vinny remained largely absent from our daily lives. He had been released on bail, secured not by our parents, but by a distant uncle who had always favored him. He was staying with friends, maintaining minimal contact while his case progressed through the legal system. His absence, while sometimes painful for my mother, created space for new family dynamics to take root and strengthen without the distortions his presence had always created. One unexpected aspect of rebuilding came through my growing relationship with Mrs. Henderson. Our weekly meetings to discuss the accelerated master's program evolved into wide-ranging conversations about mathematics, academia, and life paths. "You remind me of myself at your age," she told me during one such session, "determined not to let circumstances define your potential." "Did you face similar challenges?" I asked, curious about the personal history behind her professional success. She smiled wryly. "Different circumstances, similar themes. I was told repeatedly that women didn't belong in advanced mathematics, that I should pursue something more suitable for my gender." Her eyes sparkled with old defiance. Every barrier they erected became another puzzle for me to solve. Her mentorship provided something I hadn't realized I needed, a vision of future strength built upon present resilience. She became the living proof that standing one's ground, even when difficult, could lead to a life of purpose and accomplishment. 3. Days before I was scheduled to leave for Westridge, my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. I answered hesitantly. "Madison." Vinny's voice. "We need to talk." My heart raced, but I kept my tone neutral. "About what?" "Everything. In person. Meet me at Riverside Park in an hour?" I hesitated. Vinny and I hadn't spoken directly since before his arrest. Part of me wanted to refuse, to protect the peace I'd worked so hard to establish. But another part knew this conversation was inevitable, and perhaps necessary for true closure. "I'll be there," I said, "by the fountain." I texted Sienna immediately, "Meeting Vinny at Riverside in an hour. If you don't hear from me by 3, call me." Her response was immediate. "Want me to come with?" "I can sit nearby." I considered the offer, then declined. This was something I needed to handle alone. When I arrived at the park, Vinny was already waiting, seated on a bench near the stone fountain. He looked different, thinner, less polished, the confident swagger replaced by a wary vigilance. The legal troubles had clearly taken their toll. "Thanks for coming," he said as I approached. I sat on the opposite end of the bench, maintaining distance both physical and emotional. "What did you want to talk about?" He stared at the fountain for a long moment. "My case isn't going well. The evidence against me is substantial." "I'm sorry to hear that," I said, and meant it. Despite everything, I took no joy in his legal troubles. "The prosecutors offered a deal," he continued. "Reduce charges if I cooperate, provide information about some of the business partners who were involved." He ran a hand through his hair. "It would mean admitting guilt, but less jail time." I nodded, unsure why he was sharing this with me. "Mom and Dad have been different," he said, shifting topics abruptly. "They've never refused to help me before, never drawn a line. They're trying to make healthier choices," I said carefully. "For everyone's sake, including yours." He laughed, a short, bitter sound. "By letting me face prison alone?" "By letting you face the consequences of your actions," I corrected. "There's a difference." We sat in silence, watching the water cascade from the fountain. Finally, Vinny spoke again, his voice quieter. "I was angry when you confronted them about the college fund. Furious, actually. It felt like you were attacking me, threatening the support I'd always counted on." "It wasn't about attacking you," I said. "It was about standing up for myself." "I know that now." He picked at a loose thread on his sleeve. "When I saw your post, the simple facts without the drama I'd tried to create, something clicked. You weren't playing the same game I always had. You weren't manipulating or guilt-tripping. You were just honest." The acknowledgement surprised me. I had never expected Vinny to recognize the difference in our approaches. "The thing is," he continued, I've never had to be honest about my failures. Someone always rescued me, made excuses, found a way out. He looked at me directly for the first time. I think maybe that's why I kept failing. There was never any real consequence. The insight was startling coming from him, a level of self-awareness I hadn't thought he possessed. "So what happens now?" I asked. "I'm taking the deal," he said. "And I've made a decision to stop asking Mom and Dad for help. They offered to pay for a better attorney, but I declined. This mess is mine to handle." I studied him, trying to determine if this was genuine growth or another manipulation tactic. His eyes, so like my own, held a resignation I'd never seen before, the look of someone finally accepting reality. "That sounds healthy," I offered. He nodded. "Maybe. It's new territory for me." He hesitated, then added, "I'm sorry about your college fund. I knew it was wrong when they offered it, but I took it anyway. That was selfish." The apology, simple and direct, was so unexpected that I momentarily didn't know how to respond. "Thank you for saying that," I finally managed. "I can't pay you back," he said. "Not now. Maybe not for years. But I wanted you to know I recognize what I did. What we all did to you." We lapsed into silence again, but it was less tense than before. Something had shifted between us. Not friendship, not even true reconciliation, but a mutual recognition that had been absent our entire lives. "I hear you're heading to Westridge soon," Vinny said eventually. "Sunday," I confirmed. "I'm mostly packed." "You'll do well there," he said, and there was no sarcasm or resentment in his tone. "You always were the smart one." "Being smart isn't what matters," I replied. "It's making good choices with whatever intelligence you have." He smiled faintly. "A lesson I'm learning the hard way." As our conversation wound down, Vinny stood to leave. "I probably won't see you. Before you go, I have meetings with the prosecutors tomorrow." I nodded, rising as well. "Good luck with everything, Vinny. I mean that." "Thanks." He hesitated, then added, "Madison, I'm glad you stood up to them. To us. It was long overdue." With that, he walked away, his posture straighter than when we'd started talking, as if unburdening himself of the apology had lightened some invisible weight. I watched him go, reflecting on how completely our roles had reversed. Once, he had been the confident one, secure in his place as the family priority. Now, I was the one moving forward with purpose, while he faced the uncertain consequences of years of poor choices. The reversal brought no satisfaction, only a quiet acknowledgement that justice, when it finally arrives, often looks different than we imagined. The evening before my departure for Westridge, my parents organized a small gathering at our home. Not quite a celebration, not quite a goodbye dinner, something in between that acknowledged both my achievement and our family's tentative healing. My grandmother arrived first, carrying a small gift-wrapped package. "For your dorm room," she explained, placing it beside my packed suitcases. "Something to remind you of home." Aunt Kelly and Uncle Mickey came with their children, followed by Sienna and her parents. Even Mrs. Henderson made an appearance, bringing a vintage copy of A Mathematician's Apology by G.H. Hardy that she inscribed with a personal note. As everyone mingled in our living room, I slipped away to the kitchen for a moment of quiet. The gathering, well-intentioned as it was, felt overwhelming, too many emotions swirling beneath the polite conversation and proud smiles. My mother found me there, leaning against the counter. "Too much?" she asked perceptively. I nodded. "A little. It's nice, but we're still finding our footing," she finished for me. "All of us." She paused, then added, "I spoke with Vinny this morning. He told me about your conversation in the park." "Oh?" I wasn't sure what else to say. He said you were kind to him. more kind than he deserved. She fidgeted with her wedding ring. That's always been your way, hasn't it? Quiet strength, compassion without compromising your principles. It was perhaps the most insightful thing my mother had ever said about me, an acknowledgement of who I truly was, not who they had needed me to be. I'm trying to learn from you, she continued softly, to be stronger in my boundaries, kinder in my understanding. She reached into her pocket and withdrew an envelope. Your father and I wanted to give you this before you leave. Accepted it hesitantly. What is it? Open it, she encouraged. Inside was a bank statement for a new account in my name, with a balance of $15,000. We sold the vacation property, my mother explained. The small cabin at Lake Chelan that's been sitting empty for years. Between that and your father's car, we were able to accelerate our repayment plan. I stared at the statement, stunned. This was well beyond the scheduled payments we had agreed upon. It doesn't erase what happened, she acknowledged. But we wanted you to start college with more security than we initially provided, with the foundation you deserve. The gesture represented more than money. It was a tangible demonstration that my parents were not just meeting the minimum obligations of our agreement, but actively working to make full restoration. They were prioritizing my needs in a way they never had before. Thank you, I said, emotion thickening my voice. This means a lot, she nodded, blinking back tears of her own. We're proud of you, Madison, not just for your accomplishments, but for your character, for standing firm when it would have been easier to give in. We rejoined the gathering, where my father was in deep conversation with Mrs. Henderson about the mathematics department at Westridge. He looked up as we entered, his eyes questioning. My mother nodded, and his face relaxed into a smile. Later, as the guests began to depart, my grandmother pulled me aside. How are you feeling about tomorrow? She asked. Excited, nervous, ready? I replied. It's strange. 3 months ago, I was panicking about how I'd afford college at all. Now you have not just financial security, but a new understanding of your own strength, she finished. That's the real restoration here, Madison. Not just the money, but the confidence that you can advocate for yourself when necessary. She was right. Beyond the repaid funds, beyond the scholarships and opportunities, I had gained something far more valuable. The certainty that I could face injustice and emerge stronger, that I could draw boundaries even with those I loved, that I could demand respect without sacrificing compassion. As twilight settled over our neighborhood, I found myself alone in the backyard, sitting on the old swing set that had been there since my childhood. From this quiet vantage point, I could see through the windows into our living room, where my parents were clearing dishes, moving around each other with a new consideration that spoke of their ongoing efforts to rebuild. The path that had brought us here wasn't one I would have chosen. The betrayal of my college fund, the confrontations, Vinny's legal troubles, all of it had been painful, disruptive, unplanned. Yet looking at where we had arrived, I couldn't deny that necessary transformations had occurred. My parents had begun the difficult work of examining their enabling patterns. Vinny was finally facing the consequences of his actions without family shields. And I had discovered reserves of strength and clarity I might never have known otherwise. This wasn't a fairy tale ending with all wounds magically healed. Vinny still faced jail time. My parents still had years of financial recovery ahead. Trust, once broken, required time and consistent evidence to fully restore. But the foundation had been laid. For my education, certainly, but more importantly, for more balanced family relationships built on mutual respect rather than unquestioned patterns. As I pushed gently on the swing, feeling the familiar motion that had soothed so many childhood disappointments, I realized that this too was a form of restoration. Not a return to what was before, but the creation of something new and potentially stronger from the broken pieces of the past. 5 years later, I stood in my cap and gown, the weight of 2 tassels, one for my bachelor's degree, one for my master's, a tangible reminder of the journey that had brought me to this moment. The accelerated master's program that Mrs. Henderson had recommended had been challenging but rewarding, allowing me to complete both degrees in just 5 years. As I scanned the crowd of graduating students, I caught Sienna's eye. She flashed me a triumphant smile, her own cap adorned with the honors cords she'd earned in her psychology program. "We did it," she mouthed across the sea of graduates. We had indeed. Through late-night study sessions, research projects, internships, and all the ups and downs of college life, we had remained roommates and best friends. I couldn't imagine having navigated these years without her steadfast support. In the audience, I could see my parents and grandmother seated together, their faces shining with pride. My mother dabbed at her eyes with a tissue, while my father sat tall, his expression one of pure joy. My grandmother, now in her late 70s but still sharp as ever, nodded approvingly when she caught my gaze. The past 5 years had brought significant changes to our family. My parents had maintained their commitment to our agreement, completing the full repayment of my college fund 2 years ahead of schedule by continuing to sell unnecessary assets and live more modestly. More importantly, they had sustained the healthier boundaries and communication patterns we'd established, making our relationships stronger and more authentic than ever before. Vinny's path had been rockier. He had served 14 months in a minimum security facility for the investor fraud case. Upon release, he had struggled to find his footing, bouncing between jobs and living situations. But unlike before, our parents had maintained appropriate boundaries, offering emotional support without financial bailouts or enabling. Surprisingly, it was Mrs. Henderson who had eventually provided Vinny with an unexpected opportunity. Learning of his situation during one of our mentoring sessions, she had recommended him for a position managing the mathematics department's budget, a role that utilized his business knowledge while imposing the strict oversight and accountability he needed. "Everyone deserves a chance to rebuild," she had said when I questioned her decision. "Not without accountability, but not without opportunity either." Under her exacting standards and with the structure of university protocols, Vinny had gradually proven himself reliable. Our relationship remained distant but cordial. We would never be close, but we had reached a place of mutual respect that once seemed impossible. As the commencement ceremony concluded and graduates dispersed to find their families, I felt a strange sense of completion. Not just of my educational journey, but of the personal transformation that had begun that fateful day when I discovered my college fund was gone. My grandmother reached me first, enfolding me in a fierce hug. "I always knew you were destined for greatness," she whispered, "but watching you grow into your strength has been the privilege of my lifetime." My parents embraced me next, their pride palpable. "We have something for you," my father said, handing me an envelope similar to the one they had given me the night before I left for college. Inside was not a bank statement this time, but a deed to a small house near the university campus where I had been accepted into the PhD program. "We know you'll need a quiet place to focus on your doctoral work," my mother explained. "And after everything, we wanted to make sure you had a solid foundation, something that belongs entirely to you, that no one can take away." The gift left me speechless. It represented not just financial support, but a profound understanding of what security meant to me after the uncertainty I had faced years ago. "This is too much," I finally managed. "It's exactly enough," my father countered. "It's what we should have done all along. Invested in your future with the same commitment you've shown to creating it." Later that evening, at a small celebration dinner, I found myself seated beside Mrs. Henderson, who had become not just a mentor, but a friend over the years. "Do you ever think about how differently things might have turned out?" she asked thoughtfully. "If you hadn't stood up for yourself that day?" I considered the question carefully. "Sometimes. I might still have found a way to attend college. I was pretty determined. But I wouldn't have learned what I now know about setting boundaries, about demanding respect, about my own resilience. She nodded approvingly. The greatest education often happens outside the classroom. As I looked around the table at the people who had supported me through this journey, my grandmother with her unwavering wisdom, my parents who had learned to see me clearly, Sienna whose friendship had never faltered, Mrs. Henderson whose mentorship had opened doors I hadn't known existed, I felt a profound sense of gratitude. The injustice that had once threatened to derail my future had instead become the catalyst for growth that extended far beyond myself. My parents had been forced to confront their enabling patterns. Vinny had finally faced necessary consequences, and I had discovered a strength I might never have known I possessed. What had begun as a desperate fight for what was rightfully mine had evolved into something far more valuable, the creation of a life defined not by what others took from me, but by what I had the courage to claim for myself. The transformation was complete. Not because all wounds were healed or all challenges overcome, but because I now moved through the world as someone who knew her worth and had the courage to stand for it. A lesson more valuable than any college fund could ever provide. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.